At 1:18 a.m. local time, the most important detail in the new escalation cycle wasn't the word blockade. It was the phrase, "we'll start later." According to the BBC headline, Trump says a U.S. blockade of Iran's ports will begin later after weekend peace talks ended without a deal. That combination, talks ended, blockade scheduled, start time delayed, is not just messaging. It's a strategy. It is the moment a conflict moves from immediate strikes to timed coercion, where a clock becomes a weapon and later becomes a pressure corridor. Because a delayed blockade start is not the same as walking back the threat. It can mean the opposite. It can mean the posture is being organized, rules are being written, partners are being briefed, and the enforcement architecture is being assembled. In other words, the war is shifting from a chaotic exchange into something more structured and therefore potentially more dangerous in the long run. This is what you need to understand before you listen to a single press statement. A blockade is not a single event. It's a sustained system. It is an attempt to control access, trade flow, and maritime confidence over time. And once you announce a start time, you do two things at once. You create credibility pressure on yourself, because if you don't follow through, the threat weakens, and you create preparation pressure on the other side, because if they believe you will follow through, they start adjusting their posture immediately. That means the escalation doesn't begin when the blockade begins. It begins now, because systems react to expectations, not just actions. Shipping reacts, insurance reacts, markets react, regional partners react. And military planners on all sides begin shaping the next move around a narrower timeline. So tonight, I'm going to explain what this actually means, beyond the headline. It means the peace track failed at least publicly, and a coercive track is now being placed on a schedule. It means Washington is signaling it wants leverage that does not rely on constant airstrikes, but on economic denial, pressure against the system that supports state endurance. It means Iran will likely treat this as economic warfare and will look for ways to raise the cost of enforcement without triggering immediate full-scale escalation. It means regional states and global markets will treat the coming days as a countdown, because port access isn't just about Iran. It's about wider maritime risk and the stability premium that keeps global trade functioning. And it means the next 48 to 72 hours are not a pause. They are a pre-blockade phase, which is often when the most sensitive moves happen. Let's start with the first question that matters. What does a blockade of Iran's ports actually mean? People hear blockade and imagine an old-fashioned ring of warships. That's not how modern maritime denial usually works. In practice, a port blockade can be implemented through a combination of declared exclusion or restriction zones, inspection regimes and routing requirements, interdiction threats, and enforcement posture, legal notices and warnings that shift commercial behavior partner coordination to constrain trade and finance indirectly. The key outcome is not always the physical stopping of every vessel. The key outcome is denial through risk. If ship owners believe they may be stopped, delayed, inspected, diverted, or caught in a confrontation, they don't need to wait for the first interdiction to change behavior. They change behavior ahead of time. Insurers raise premiums. Some firms pause cargoes. Some routes get repriced. Some ships choose not to enter the risk box at all. That's why a port blockade threat is so powerful economically. It weaponizes uncertainty. And uncertainty is often enough to achieve partial denial without firing a shot. Now, the headline says, blockade will start later. That implies the U.S. is trying to convert the threat into a structured operational instrument, not just a warning, an actual plan with timing, sequencing, and enforcement shape. And that timing matters because time creates leverage. The delay window can be used to push Iran back toward a deal by showing the cost will become real, or it can be used to build the enforcement posture that makes the threat credible. Often, it's both. The threat is diplomacy with teeth, while also being a military and economic commitment. Now let's connect that to the second half of the headline. Weekend peace talks ended without a deal. Why that changes the risk profile immediately. When talks end without a deal, it doesn't just mean no agreement. It means the conflict's internal logic has shifted. As long as talks are active and credible, both sides typically operate under a restraint logic. Avoid actions that collapse the channel, avoid actions that create irreversible domestic political pressure, avoid actions that force the other side to respond publicly. Once talks end without a deal, the restraint logic weakens. Both sides begin preparing for a world where the next phase is driven by leverage, not compromise. And in this case, the leverage instrument being announced is not a strike. It's a blockade. That's important, because it signals a strategic pivot from immediate physical destruction to sustained denial and pressure on state function. That is systems warfare, not necessarily bombing the state, pressuring the state's ability to operate within global trade flows. Now, why would Washington move to this tool? Because blockade pressure does three things strikes do not do as efficiently. It is continuous, not episodic. It threatens money flows and trade behavior, not just infrastructure. And it can be scaled, tightened, or relaxed. creating a lever that can be adjusted during renewed negotiations. In other words, it is coercion that can be turned like a dial, but that dial is attached to global trade. That's why it's risky. The credibility trap. Once you announce a start time, you're bound by it. This is one of the most dangerous mechanics in escalation politics. If a leader publicly sets a start time for a coercive action and then does not follow through, credibility is damaged. That damage doesn't stay in one issue. It spreads. It tells the opponent future threats can be tested. It tells allies the strategy is uncertain. It tells markets that chaos may be managed by unpredictable rhetoric rather than consistent policy. So, the announcement creates pressure to act, even if acting is costly. That's why later is not reassuring. It can be a countdown, it can be a staging window, it can be a sign that the decision is no longer whether to do it, but how to do it. That brings us to the next critical question. What does Iran do before a blockade begins? Here is the strategic reality. In coercion timelines, the pre-action window is often more important than the action itself. Why? Because the side being pressured will try to shape the environment before the pressure fully lands. That can include diplomatic outreach to frame the blockade as illegitimate, attempts to rally international opposition by emphasizing global economic risk, strategic signaling designed to raise the expected cost of enforcement actions, designed to demonstrate that the coercive plan will not be one-sided. This does not require immediate direct confrontation. In modern maritime and economic coercion, much of the pressure is psychological and financial, measured in premiums, delays, volatility, and uncertainty. Iran may aim to internationalize the crisis. The U.S. may aim to isolate it. That's the narrative war. And the narrative war matters because it shapes who will cooperate with enforcement, who will condemn it, and how shipping markets will behave. The global consequence: ports are not just Iranian, they are connected. A blockade of Iran's ports is being framed as a targeted action, but the maritime system is interconnected. Shipping is an ecosystem. When one zone becomes high risk, traffic patterns shift, and risk pricing changes elsewhere too. Neighboring ports face increased scrutiny, shipping lanes get crowded, insurers become more conservative. Some operators may choose safer routes even if longer and more expensive. That produces ripple effects, delays, higher freight costs, and market nervousness. That is why this escalation becomes global quickly. Not because Iran's ports are the world's only ports, but because the maritime system is a network where risk spreads. Now add energy markets. Even if the blockade is framed around ports broadly, markets will interpret it as a broader risk to Gulf stability. And markets do not need certainty to react. They need credible probability. That is why blockades are dangerous tools. They produce global consequence even when they are not fully executed. Defense math. Why enforcement is expensive and disruption is cheap. Here's the defense math that sits behind every maritime denial crisis. To enforce denial, a state needs ships on station, continuously aircraft and surveillance to maintain awareness, command and control systems to coordinate decisions, rules of engagement that reduce accidental escalation, inspection capacity and legal frameworks, partner coordination to avoid political blowback. That's a lot of structure. To disrupt confidence, the other side does not need to defeat the Navy. It only needs to convince commercial actors that the situation is unpredictable. That can be achieved through rhetoric, warnings, sporadic incidents, or signals that the enforcement posture could face resistance. Again, perception matters as much as action. This is why a blockade becomes a long-term stress test. The enforcing side pays for certainty. The resisting side tries to profit from uncertainty, and that makes later meaningful. It suggests the U.S. is preparing to pay the cost of enforcement, or at least to prepare a posture credible enough that markets believe it will. What Washington is trying to achieve with a scheduled blockade. If talks failed and blockade is now the lever, Washington's objectives likely include forcing a new negotiation dynamic by increasing economic pressure, constraining Iran's access to trade and revenue, shaping regional behavior by signaling control over maritime space, deterring escalation by raising costs for continued resistance, reassuring domestic audiences that failure of talks doesn't mean lack of options. But the critical part is the last one. The failure of talks creates political pressure to do something. Blockade language becomes the something, especially when war fatigue exists and when leaders want leverage that appears decisive without immediately expanding kinetic operations. However, what looks decisive in a speech can become complex in execution. What Tehran is likely trying to achieve in response, Iran's objectives in this phase would likely include preventing the blockade from becoming normalized, raising the political cost of enforcement, internationally preserving deterrence by demonstrating it cannot be coerced without consequence, maintaining internal legitimacy by avoiding the appearance of capitulation, keeping open the possibility of renewed talks while strengthening its bargaining position. This is the key paradox. Iran may want to resume talks later, but only after demonstrating that the U.S. cannot impose a blockade without facing risk. That is how coercion cycles intensify. Each side tries to prove it controls escalation while avoiding full war. Why this can spiral faster than people expect. The most dangerous thing about blockades is that they create repeated decision points. A single airstrike is one decision. A blockade is hundreds of decisions. Each ship, each approach, each inspection, each warning, each response. That repetition increases the probability of miscalculation. It also creates more opportunities for spoiler behavior. Actors who want escalation can attempt to provoke incidents in a domain where attribution can be contested and where the global stakes are high. And once the world's trade system is involved, the pressure to react grows quickly, because governments have to respond not only to security risk, but to economic risk. The start-later window may be the most volatile period. This is counterintuitive, but historically and structurally true. If a blockade is scheduled, the pre-blockade period becomes a leverage contest. The enforcing side wants to demonstrate seriousness without triggering immediate blowback. The targeted side wants to prevent normalization and create costs. Partners want clarity and stability. Markets want predictability and will punish uncertainty. So the period before enforcement can include intense signaling, diplomatic pressure, and heightened readiness. And that is why you should treat the coming days as a countdown in which both sides will try to shape the system before it locks. What to watch next? The signals that tell you whether this is real. If you want to know whether blockade later becomes operational policy or remains rhetorical pressure, watch these signals. Watch 1. Official maritime notices and procedural language. If you see formal procedural language, warnings to shipping, defined rules, inspection requirements, exclusion descriptions, then the system is being built. A blockade doesn't exist without procedure. Watch 2. Commercial behavior. Insurance pricing, reroutes, port delays, and shipping advisories often shift before governments confirm operational details. Commercial actors are risk-sensitive and fast. Watch 3. Naval posture. Visible repositioning of naval assets, escort patterns, or increased surveillance presence indicates seriousness. Absence may indicate rhetoric, or covert posture not meant for public display. Watch 4. Iranian framing and counter signals. If Iran focuses on international condemnation and economic warfare framing, it may be trying to build diplomatic resistance. If it issues specific counter warnings, it may be preparing for direct confrontation. Watch 5. Side fronts and proxy temperatures. When maritime coercion rises, side front pressure often rises too. Because leverage becomes multi-domain, any spikes elsewhere may indicate bargaining pressure is expanding. Watch 6. Back-channel language. Even when talks ended without a deal, private channels may still exist. Any hint of contacts continue or technical discussions suggests diplomacy isn't dead, just paused. Watch 7. Market volatility. Volatility is the real stress signal, not the absolute oil price. Volatility tells you markets don't believe the situation is controllable. Bottom line, a scheduled blockade of Iran's ports after peace talks end without a deal is not just a headline change. It is a shift in the conflict's logic, from episodic military action to sustained economic coercion. It moves the contest into the domain where global systems react quickly and where miscalculation risk rises because decisions are repeated daily, not made once. In one line, the talks may have ended, but a blockade start time means the next phase is being put on a clock, and clocks create pressure that can break restraint fast. The coming days are not about whether anyone wants peace. They're about whether the system can stabilize before the blockade posture hardens, and before Iran decides it must prove that maritime denial is not free. Watch the procedures, watch the shipping behavior, watch the posture, watch the language. Because in a port blockade crisis, the most decisive move often happens before the first ship is stopped, when the world decides whether it believes the threat is real.